All right. For those of you who care, some of you who were here last year may remember this gentleman, Jorge Sebastiao, and his bio's online, and he was the quiet gentleman sitting up at the top of the stairs on your computer the whole time, George, last year, as I remember. Yeah. George lives and breathes Middle East and I'll let you describe yourself, but he is in Morocco now. We're doing our best to maintain a connection, and because we got bandwidth here. So during this presentation, please, for those of you that have been streaming and using bandwidth, if we could tone it down at least for this, to make sure that we have minimal interruptions into our bandwidth. George, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Win. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure again to be here this year, even if it's a bit far away, so I could not really make the trip down to Nashville, Tennessee. So we're using the beautiful part of Morocco along with a bit of good bandwidth to drive the message across. I travel pretty much across most of the Middle East countries, maybe with the exception of Iran so far, and a lot of the African countries, especially sub-Saharan and Northern African countries. So that covers pretty much, we can say, the wide Middle East. So today, my topic is a bit about the Middle East cyber war, so I'll try to kind of bring you a little bit up to date on some of the topics, and hopefully we'll make it interesting for the next 45, 50 minutes. Okay, so I guess the topic is probably appropriate. Are you ready for the Middle East cyber wars? And I guess this applies certainly as much to the Middle East cyber wars towards the Middle East, or cyber wars potentially originating in the Middle East, as certainly some have been experiencing. So getting straight into the topic, since I work for an organization that has some very serious ambitions, I have to start with the disclaimer that this is my presentation on this topic. Certainly not the opinion of my organization that I happen to do some work for. It is some researched material and based on knowledge and a lot of co-worker colleagues. And obviously, it's a matter of opinion, so do not try this at home. So the Middle East continues to evolve, I guess, at a fairly rapid pace. As you can see, you can call it, I guess, the much wilder Middle East. And certainly one thing that you've seen, there's a lot of activity, some attempts to maybe potentially even redraw some borders as we proceed. Obviously, all this conflict exists on the ground in the physical world, but it's also at the same time creating an arms race in the cyber world. So, and this cyber world affects directly the Middle East, but also tends to kind of overflow to the wider Middle East or even to Europe or North America from time to time, as certainly it's been experienced in the past. In order to understand a bit of the capabilities in the arms race, this is, I guess, where we kind of wrapped up last year. Although the numbers may be a little bit dated, but certainly they apply here in the sense that you can have at the top of the list countries like US and Israel spending the biggest amount of money and allowing them to build up capability. But certainly what we have seen is many other countries like Turkey, certainly Iran and Saudi Arabia and UAE spending a lot more in the upcoming years and allow them to build up capability in the physical world as well as in the cyber world. And certainly another country that needs to be added to this top of the list is Qatar, because of Qatar is playing a much more active role in all these borders. So if you go back to a few years ago, where the first submarine cables cuts happened in 2008, they were actually originally designed to affect one specific country, but this cable cuts actually affected the physical infrastructure of many of the other neighboring countries. So you can see.
Hold on one second, Joel. Can you tell them we're not seeing your slides advance?
You're not seeing my slide advance. Okay, so let me.
First one. You got to go to full presentation mode on the lower left.
I went to full presentation mode.
Oh, no, in PowerPoint.
I am in PowerPoint, but I am in Apple.
Go to full screen mode. I think it's your F5 key.
Yes, I'm in full screen mode. It's what's called normal, slideshow view.
We're seeing something different, so you may have to manually slide down on the left-hand column.
Let me see layout. Let me see. Okay.
F5.
Okay. No, let me try to sort of go back. 1 second. We will have 2 or 3 options. So one option is to certainly. Let me see for this. I'll try to go back to the other start, stop sharing that, and maybe share something else. Let's see what happens here.
That's your lovely case.
But there is no, I do not see the other application, which is the PowerPoint view. Although it is active now, it does not show up as an application. So I will have to do it probably just manually. So I'll just shrink the left-hand side.
Emails him the presentation, he can run it as he speaks.
I'll share this one. So share. This will be as close. Let me see if I can shrink some things.
That looks good. That's fine.
So you can see Middle East borders.
Can't read it. Good copy.
I can maybe even zoom this a bit more. So this should give you a better feeling. So arms race, you can see. Okay, so this is pretty much the spending that keeps on increasing in the physical world, but also translates into the cyber world as well. The submarine cable cuts that happened in 2008 was kind of an initial wake-up call. It affected quite a lot of the countries, including Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, etc. But of course, one of the major countries that got affected was certainly Egypt. But Egypt not only got affected in the early days by the cable cut, but also by the 2 versions of the Egyptian revolution. You can say the first version was known as the Arab Spring. The second one was later known as the Arab Autumn, which is kind of the cold shower that tends to happen a bit after the first version. So as a result, you saw a lot of cyber activity happening and a lot of disruption that actually occurred in the electronic world. The real much bigger wake-up calls came, of course, when Iran got attacked with Stuxnet. It took some time to figure out who was doing the attacks and realized very quickly who were the 2 or 3 primary originators, and it changed the rules. But the other one, a lot of the rules, you can say, was Shamoon when Saudi Arabia and Qatar got attacked. And they quickly realized that, oh, this is affecting oil production, which is today producing a big percentage of our national revenue. So this kind of direct impact of what we can refer to as critical infrastructure resulted in a lot of these countries starting to take steps to have critical infrastructure protecting agencies. 2 of the major countries that have undertaken projects on this is certainly visible are in Saudi Arabia and UAE, but other ones are in the process of initiating some, like Qatar and others. Others lag a bit behind, like Bahrain and Kuwait, but they will have to pick up some pace as well. So all these national disasters give visibility to the risk that was upon the national economy of those affected countries. So when we look at the crisis management, not at the organization level, but at the country level, the question was, can some of these countries actually survive one of these disasters, and will this impact dramatically the operation of the country or survival of the economy of the country in the future? Of course, this critical infrastructures vary a lot from country to country, but certainly telecommunications, banking, other ones that certainly, and telecom, but other ones include, for example, water supply. If you take a city like Riyadh, they have water supply that lasts somewhere between 3 to 5 days. So if somebody was going to attack the water system that is desalinated and comes from Eastern Province, a city of about 5 to 6 million people would become unlivable in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 days. You can quickly realize that the impacts on the critical infrastructure depend a lot on the nature of the risks that are associated with the Middle East. Now, some countries in the Middle East have lots of resources, others don't. And they are all expected to cope with these changes. And certainly, if you take a country, for example, like Bangladesh, where about 84% of their websites, and I'm talking every website, including government and other critical ones, have at least one SEV1 vulnerability, you quickly realize that these countries don't necessarily have the resources or the capabilities to deploy the necessary protection mechanisms to defend themselves. So this allowed the creation of new organizations like the OIC Cooperation Center, in which cyber attack knowledge is basically being shared across all Islamic countries today. This is actually being hosted as part of Oman CERT, so it's an extension of the Oman CERT in Muscat. So when we talk about this new approach towards protecting themselves, is how much risk can these countries or these organizations take in order to be able to defend themselves? So who gets attacked first? Who has the biggest pies to lose? We saw already the example of Shamoon in the critical oil industry, another industry in the region that has gone from very small to very big is certainly the telecom industry, and they have been one of the major sources of recent attacks, and they have gotten much bigger distributed denial of services attacks in the order of 300 gigabits. Of course, countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or UAE do not have always the capability to defend themselves against such attacks that might consume most of the available international bandwidth for those countries. So mobile networks are now becoming sometimes the number 2 or number 3 organization in the country in terms of global revenue. So they play a critical infrastructure in terms of supporting the activities in the country, but they're also a very large organization supporting GDP activity. Some of the big changes that obviously happen is the availability of what we call mercenaries for hire. These mercenaries come from today 3 primary sources: oligarchs in the old Russia, Ukraine, some Asian millionaires funding some, or in the drug cartels of Middle to Central and South America. So these organizations are willing to fund attacks as long as the payoff is worth enough for them. So this is dramatically changing the rules of the game. Who has access to technology that can launch much more sophisticated attacks? And you can certainly see that some countries would be willing to hire these resources on a much short notice, thus allowing them to build capability much more quickly. Many of you may have remember a few years ago, there's a guy called Roberto Petroni. We got into a bit of trouble, a good friend as well in ICT security, created something called Wabi Sabi Labi back in 2007, which was designed to be kind of an exploit marketplace. A few of them have come and gone, but you can say the latest incarnation of this is the real deal, which includes the usage of modern bitcoins and the capability of buying really damaging exploits. Exploits can go as low as a few $1,000s, reach middle $20,000, and can go as much as $500,000, depending on the kind of damage they can actually do and the interest by specific countries in those exploits. So you can say that countries today are building a store of these exploits that they will be able to use on demand basis if the need to use them ever came about. So you combine this with the mercenaries, and you can see the recipe gets a bit more complicated. Okay, not all the countries have the same capabilities, but a small country like Israel sees himself surrounded by foes, and of course has one of the biggest capabilities after the US today, although it's a very small country in size. A country like Iran, which is much bigger, and just also in population or even sometimes in technically available resources, as the one that has amassed the greatest critical mass in things like cyber army after other regions, like, for example, China or others. But certainly Iran in the Middle East is becoming a major potential superpower. And you can see that countries like Israel see this as a big threat, and obviously the alliances keep shifting all the time. So today, foes of Israel before, like Saudi Arabia or so, are now becoming friends. So the alliances are changing much more rapidly. Since telcos do play a very important role in the generation of revenue, but also in the generation of the attacks. Certainly one remembers what happened in Mumbai. Mobiles, voice over IP technology and others played an important role in giving capabilities to attacks. And the same thing obviously happened in Pakistan during the school massacre that happened by the Taliban. So the response from the country was, we're going to fingerprint everybody, and if we don't have the fingerprint associated with the SIM card, those phones will simply go dead and they'll stop functioning. So there's very critical response towards the telco operators and protecting the telco data, because they see that as a very vital resource. Other areas that are affected or have affected the telco side, besides the DOS and obviously the control of the telco industry, is a cyber attack like Regin, which came a little bit after Shamoon, and it was used against telcos, in which they were trying to even invade the point of even base stations. So they will actually be able to actually create denial of service conditions on the radio base stations. Now, Regin was not only itself used to invade the GSM networks, but also was used to attack other organizations like educational, governments, etc., financial institutions. It was primarily a discovery, but it had also attack capabilities. The command and control center for this specific Trojan was found itself to be located somewhere in India, increasing the visibility of this country and the Middle East cyber warfare. Now, so far we've talked about some very sophisticated potential attacks, the increase of marketplace for zero-day exploits, but one should not forget that we seem to always be missing the basics. Most of the attacks today actually start with very simple phishing scams. We saw this happen to RSA, but this went much well beyond RSA. We have specifically one individual was able to draft himself a letter that allowed him actually to leave prison. Now, you can quickly examine that phishing, especially if it carried out correctly, can actually drive a very good, effective approach. One example was the Syrian Electronic Army used phishing to actually attack the counter-Syrian rebels by creating a website in which you had very interesting women, in this case veiled, that would appeal to the rebels, and they were able to actually get some rebels information, and they were able to disable their activities. Again, this was very simple but very effective, sophisticated phishing attempts. You can see that even today in the electronically cyber war world, sex has the capability of being a quick win. Now, the Syrian Electronic Army has been in the news quite a few times by attacking a lot of the news stations like, for example, CNBC, Forbes, Tribune, etc. So they have developed, although they're a quite small organization, the capability to reach far and about. They have been able not only to deface things like Forbes, but at the same time, they're actually able to capture a lot of the user IDs and passwords, and they threatened to actually release 1 million user IDs and passwords for Forbes while it actually got hacked. One other more recent attack was the putting out of the TV5 from the ISIS group, the Cyber Caliphate. They were able to take out TV5 from actually being able to broadcast. So all of a sudden, the radars went up. All of a sudden, ISIS has all of a sudden developed very sophisticated capabilities of attack. But one quickly realized, very similar to the case of the phishing attempt, one would realize that the actual password for this cyber attack was actually posted on YouTube. One of the announcers from TV5, while it was being recorded on an interview, featured the Wi-Fi passwords just behind his head. So anybody who actually watched the YouTube, which had probably 500,000 hits or so, had access to these passwords and was able to then launch a much more sophisticated attacks. So regardless of the new technologies that we use for cyber warfare, even the basics somewhere seem to be either missing or create very emergency attacks and a lot of trouble. There's other tools that have evolved similar to Regin. One is Babar and Casper that have been tracked down to the French cyber intelligence groups that obviously have been gathering more capabilities in the Middle East and certainly more interest and being able to be involved in the region in a much more effective way. Sometimes the things we discover is where we expect them to list. I remember mentioning you last year where when a laptop was captured in Pakistan, it gave a whole new capability of technologies that allow them to bypass the existing monitoring methods. This particular laptop that got captured by the British intelligence in Afghanistan held the laptop that contained some of the attack plans. This resulted in obviously some direct drone attacks on some of the Al-Qaeda leaders, and also some of the plans that they were using towards potentially creating sub-warfare activities. And you can imagine that this kind of plans could easily be drawn up because they were actually linked to existing websites that are extremely popular. Other basics that we seem to have forgotten completely is certainly the usage of social networks. ISIS certainly being able to use social networks much more effective than we have expected. ISIS backers grabbed something like 46,000 Twitter accounts in 2014 alone. So they have been able to use the social media much more effective than their cyber defenders. They have created their own version of Facebook, so kind of a parallel Facebook world, Kefala book, which is their Islamic version, allowing them to obviously network and exchange potential information. Some of this information obviously is being exchanged via information that is being encrypted into images, but allows them to obviously carry much more sophisticated plans of attack. ISIS has participated in quite a lot of these web defacements, and some of them have been primarily due to a lot of the vulnerabilities that have existed in WordPress. So these web defacements obviously have resulted in other examples of attacks, one where they ended up posting the pictures of 100 US military personnel, and they called it the kind of the hit list or the kill list, in which the idea was to say, and they were trying to find potential people that will take the job of actually, or the lone wolves to attack these individuals. So we said, where did they actually get this entire list? Well, they have some new, very sophisticated mechanism to go out and collect this from the US military. But we quickly realized that a simple Google search was able to retrieve most of this information. So obviously information such as Google search that can be used for one approach can also be used for the exact opposite in the same way. So it needs to be certainly controlled or viewed in a completely different way when we look in the today's world. ISIS and the Cyber Caliphate also hacked Malaysia Airlines after the experiences that you saw, and they actually brought down the website for a period of time. So they do have developed some capabilities. As you know, Malaysia is one of the countries in the Middle East Asian corridor that certainly has developed a very good cyber defense mechanism. They have also a very active CERT for a number of years. Now, since they know of the existence of much better monitoring methods, a lot of these individuals have taken to the dark web by using Tor or other similar technologies basically avoided being tracked, or at least making tracking of their activities much more difficult. So Anonymous then decided to attack ISIS as well. So they decided to create highly distributed denial of service attacks against some of the ISIS social networks, etc. The interesting operation about this attack is, although it was partly successful, the technology like Cloudflare was actually used to protect ISIS websites. We have on one side technology that is actually being used by good organizations, can also be used by all to actually defend themselves in a much more effective way. So you can see the alliances, or the usage keeps changing very dramatically. There's a very interesting project called Pistachio Harvest that was produced by two organizations that that drive a lot of information about Iran's capabilities, and also the fact that they have increased substantial the number of attacks, and an increase of 128% in 2014. So you can see that they're building much more sophisticated capabilities. Now, these are some extracts from this capability by AEI and Norse, that they established a database to be able to track these attacks globally, and they basically build a knowledge base on these attacks. But these kind of potential attacks are not just about traditional websites or knowledge information or military, but also targeting the critical infrastructure of other neighboring or even much more foreign countries. This gets back to the beginning of my presentation when I talked a little bit about Stuxnet, in the sense that it is not recommended usually in the Middle East, and there's a very old saying that says, please do not throw a rock at your neighbor if your house happens to be made out of glass. What it really means is that we have launched fairly sophisticated cyber attacks, but at the same time, we have not developed the capabilities to protect some of our basic critical infrastructure. This obviously not only applies to the nuclear plants, but also to the US grid, which has been identified as being potentially highly vulnerable. So if a sophisticated or medium to high sophisticated attack was to be launched, the impact would be fairly critical and much more than any other countries in the world. Iranian are also developing or promising to develop new robot technologies similar to the drones that you have seen in US military, and certainly they have been able to capture previous drones in the past, like we saw in last year's presentation. So it's very easy to take things apart and start at least attempted copying some of that potential material. Other potential vulnerable or high target areas, ground or plane control systems. As you can see, small disruptions on this can cause a lot of potential disruption to the environment of the United States, given the amount of flights that take off and every minute. One interesting gentleman, Mr. Kaspersky, has created an interesting illusion about a couple of years ago, is how we're going to manage this entire chaos. Certainly, the Middle East is far from getting there, but we need to develop the right protocols of declaring cyber war and how we kind of control this cyber war when it actually gets a little bit out of hand. When we talk a little bit more about Iran, there's some reports that obviously say or increase the capabilities of Iran, but certainly other ones completely dismiss it. I think the truth probably lies somewhere in between. So the country certainly has developed medium to increase sophistication at a very rapid pace, and certainly should not be ignored about their full capabilities. Other interesting papers that certainly would apply also in the Middle East is some of the cyber war game lessons. So I think everybody needs to practice with these new organizations to learn a little bit more how to control these incident responses in cases of crisis, how to actually control information such as attack attribution, and then being able to respond in a proper manner. One good example of this was certainly UK recently created a cyber terror simulation over several days. And obviously information or these kind of exercises or the information generated from such exercises will lead to a much better level of protection at the country or inter-country level. Getting back to a good old known faction that I tend to plug in every time, time still plays a very important aspect. And here I call about time in the notion of agility of the incident response. So some of the lessons learned from the elements of the presentation today that I wanted to cover: certainly don't throw rocks if your house is made out of glass. Get down to the basics, because we're still facing, failing very miserably in the protection on the basic elements. So we don't actually need always very sophisticated cyber weapons to actually create a lot of disruption. One element that we need to develop a lot is certainly agility, and the Middle East countries are now creating the capability to do that, and this includes the 3 or 4 primary countries that I mentioned before, apart from obviously Iran and Israel, but certainly Saudi Arabia is asserting himself as a power, Qatar, and obviously a UAE as well. So they're all concerned with protecting their critical infrastructure, but we still are missing how to control social media. So there's certainly a lot of lessons learned that can be taken from this and certainly could be applied in the future context. That's a little bit the information that I had for you today. So hopefully you find it interesting. Looking forward to a few minutes of questions.
Thank you, George.
Hey, George.
Yes.
On slide number 49, you say you typed out the word counter, but you used the word control. Which one did you mean?
49.
The bottom line, slide 49.
Yes.
You see, you used the word counter there, and you typed out the word counter, but
actually controls social media. This is the auto spelling.
Oh, okay.
But actually, to some extent, is also counter, but it's more controlled social media. Certainly, the Middle East countries have taken the approach of controlling social media, but there's ways to also counter social media. But certainly, the countries like US or others have not developed yet always the capability to counter social media effectively. What it really means is that simple organizations like the Syrian Electronic Army or ISIS, for example, which is locally known as Daesh, have been able to use social media much more effectively. If you go back to my presentation of last year, certainly the release of the Abu Ghraib pictures generated a whole big headache on social media. And it seems like we have not learned. ISIS has been able to repeat and use social media much more effectively. And this social media, by the way, is being used today for recruiting and many other aspects. And either we are not blocking the accounts or we're not doing a counter response that is effective enough to this social media usage.
Thank you. Next question.
Other questions, comments? He's too far away to hit.
Andreas for whiskey.
Sure, I would like. It will be nice to have a nice cold drink, but I'll try to have one locally here. So
well, there seems to be an asymmetry in the way that an organization like ISIS can employ cyber activities, in that their adversary, i.e. the West, tends to be a lot more dependent on networks and systems for critical infrastructures and for life in general than they do. So how do you then, in that asymmetric type of environment, turn the tables? Is there any way to do so? Or do we just simply accept the fact that we are always going to be more vulnerable than they are to anything in the cyberspace?
I think this is a very good point. I think the modern world is much more asymmetric by nature. Is asymmetric in many ways. The capabilities of both parties are many ways far apart, and they're using sometimes very basic techniques. But the thing doesn't matter. Even in this asymmetric world, you see that the very basic techniques that they use are actually being used very effectively. And although we have very sophisticated cyber weapons or certs, etc., we're not able to respond to those very basic techniques. And by the way, this applies to phishing attempts or others. So that really means that, yes, we're investing all these new capabilities. Certainly Canada is investing a lot in this research field with the central organization in which they have developed partially an offensive capability. We have seen China developing an offensive capability, as you saw in most recent reports. But you can see quickly that this is good, but we're still failing some of the basics, which for me is quite amazing.
But you think we're kind of failing the basics because we don't have as much of a plan as ISIS has? I mean, they have a point to go towards. They have a strategy. They have a goal to attain. We do not have a goal other than to say, like, oh, no, they're wrong.
Actually, it's a combination of many of the items that you outlined. Although ISIS appears to be unorganized and very haphazard, they actually have a very well-defined structure. There's a couple of documents that have been recently captured, and some of them have been discussed. Some of the activities they do, they appear to be very strange or very all over the map in nature, but they actually have a purpose in which they're being used. And in the purpose in which they're being used, they're delivering an effective response to them, or an effective value by the action they have taken. But we don't seem to be able to be in a position to actually counteract this effect in an organized or effective way. And by the way, this applies as simple as by themselves using a Cloudflare to defend some of their websites. So that means they're using the same technologies that we're providing to everybody else to prevent, for example, a distributed denial of service against their message delivering infrastructure.
Anyone for George? All right, George, thank you very much for taking time.
Have a good. Thank you, George.